between Abel and myself, we will end up taking you through the journey of EV and trying to map India and Africa, the journeys together. There are contrasts, there are similarities, there are learnings, and there are patterns. So without getting into too much of context, we'll just jump onto the slides. Thank you. So first up, broadly, both are fairly nascent markets, and we have seen that in India, we have a remarkable similarity between 2-3-wheelers and the other residual category, which is on the buses and every other commercial movements. And then there is a larger overwhelming part about it is the 4-wheeler EVs. The larger report that you see on the slide from the India standpoint is what our team led by Arpit published with the EV primer and the modifications and the versions that came thereafter. So just full credit given its due. So each of these are equal buckets broadly between 2-3-wheelers and others, and the larger dominating part is the 4-wheelers. And the good news here is that by virtue of the capex involved, etc., the incumbents are playing as much of a role along with the startups. So it does make it a fairly capex intensive market. Abel?
Yeah. And I think in Africa, what we're seeing is, can you go back to the slide before that? So in Africa, we're seeing a lot of adoption in the 2-wheeler space and in the bus section, as opposed to the 4-wheeler and 3-wheeler side. And the main reason for the 4-wheeler side is Africa is majority used car market, and so the car prices are a lot cheaper if you compare with electric, and so we haven't seen a lot of adoption in the 4-wheeler space. But in the 2-wheeler space, we've started seeing, especially last year was a big transition year, where we saw lots of companies kind of hitting scale in that. And then in the bus space, the economics actually make sense, especially if you're importing from China, and then some of the countries like Rwanda have put in incentives that help that transition on the bus side and also on the 2-wheeler side. So this is what we've seen in Africa. So it's more of a 2-wheeler space. So we did a sector map last year where we kind of mapped out the different types of 2-wheelers on the continent and where the adoption or where the transition is happening. So for example, if you see the first three, so the scooters, mopeds, underbones. So we were in India the other day, and what we see in India, a lot of the scooters, mopeds, and underbones are being electrified and not so much on the motorcycle. And the use cases in a lot of these cases is quick commerce. So for quick commerce, you don't really need a powerful bike. But then on the continent, initially a lot of the companies that came up in the EV space were essentially trying to import these electric scooters or electric mopeds, but a lot of them didn't work out because the use cases in Africa for 2-wheelers is mostly for commercial purposes. So 90% of the bikes on the continent are actually used either to carry passengers or to carry heavy loads like, probably 200, 300 kilos. And so if you try bring an electric scooter, there are videos where a few of them were, they couldn't climb hills and had to let the customers walk with them. And so what happened over the last 2 years was a lot of the companies you see there, Rome, Ampersand, Spiro, kind of worked on getting a bike that actually worked for the continent, and which was an equivalent of 150cc 2-wheeler here in India or in any part of the world. Yeah. And in terms of the number of this is what we're seeing or what is being projected. In terms of the annual sales, so ICE is still probably a big part of it. But as you see, there's going to be an inflection point around 2028 where we'll start seeing a lot more EVs being sold on the continent than EVs. And in Africa, if you see on the second paragraph, while India is probably 3 times in terms of annual sales for 2-wheelers. In terms of the fuel consumption per capita, Africa is a lot more. So in Africa, while we're selling only 5 billion worth of 2-wheelers, we're spending about 25 billion in fuel for 2-wheelers because a lot of these bikes are being used for commercial purposes, so they end up covering probably 5 times the distance that a normal personal use in India could.
So also, when I was mentioning earlier about the breakup between the 2, 3, and 4, that is the OEMs part of it. And when we look at the rest of the industry, OEMs pretty much becomes a healthy 50% subset. And then there is a massive, again, components plus the ecosystem solutions. And within the components also, a very, very large chunk is on the materials, obviously, because that forms the crux of the entire machine. And when it comes to the overall ecosystem solutions, the two big ones are, of course, the software charge and the charging infrastructure, and then the financial services of it. But there have been a fair bit of challenges around some of these to take off, which we will discuss. But broadly speaking, the thought process, as we see, is to get looking at all of these as ecosystem, and the investments that have been happening are across the value chain. But when you will observe and you look at some of the data as we talk along, you will observe that those investments are slightly on the lower side at each passing successive year by virtue of the capex intensity and the fact that what is venture fundable very quickly moves into the PE fundable kind of a category.
Yeah. So I didn't have key stats similar to what India has, but so in Africa, what we're seeing is it's a very small market now, but I think it's growing very fast. And some of the things that are helping the growth of e-mobility on the continent is one, especially on the two-wheeler side, is battery swapping. So battery swapping essentially removes the cost of the battery away from the bike. So you kind of finance a bike without the battery and then kind of make it a subscription. And that reduces the upfront cost of the bike, and that has created a lot of uptake. And then there's growing networks of battery swapping stations, especially Nairobi, Kampala, Kigali. And the other driver of adoption on the continent is ride-hailing and delivery fleets that are adopting two-wheelers. And then in terms of the number of bikes that were sold, electric bikes that were sold last year in the continent, it was around 50,000. But that's projected to get to about 500,000, which is roughly $2 billion in sales over the next 3-4 years. And then the other driver is on the cost savings, because a lot of these riders are using it for commercial purposes, so they end up covering 90 or 100 kilometers. Actually, for some of the companies, they're actually covering even 200, 300 kilometers a day, because these are high-frequency routes or high-frequency use cases. And the savings on those is up to 30 or more than 30%.
So coming to the comparison with not just between India and Africa, but when we overall look at how the electrification has happened across various markets, it's not very, very surprising that there is a massive headroom to grow here, where today we have less than about 10-12% overall penetration. When you look at some of the other markets like China, the ratios are very, very significantly higher, more than 3x of where we are at in India. But India is not way off from where the US is in that sense. And while we are accelerating it, the key role that has been played is the combination of demand side pushes and the supply side pushes, where there have been very significant initial thrust with the government trying to push through subsidies and the FAME initiatives and all that. And over a period of time, we have also seen that the consumer interests have been growing. The whole ability to just simply have the home charging infrastructure for both two-wheelers and three-wheelers have been giving it the thrust. But we are yet to see the mega rise to happen. I do feel that the platform has been set, and there are going to be a significant headroom over the next about 3 to 5 years in the coming years. It also adds the fact that the start happened with the startups, etc., but we have seen a fair bit of push with the incumbents also catching up very, very fast. And talking about Africa, Abel, we have even a higher room.
Yeah, I mean, so in Africa, as you can see, the adoption is very low, so 0.1%. But it's because of a few reasons. So one of them is, fuel subsidies. So several African countries have fuel subsidies, which make, the transition to electric very hard. Because like Nigeria, Egypt, which are probably the largest two-wheeler markets on the continent, they have fuel subsidies, which make the cost of, like an ICE very, very cheap. And then in a lot of countries on the continent, there's intermittent power, so lack of power essentially. And then we're dependent a lot on imports from India and China. So as you can know, like there's a lot of import duties, which makes the electric vehicles a lot more expensive. And then the charging infrastructure is not there as well. So which, it creates a lot of range anxiety for drivers. So a lot of the adoption is usually just educating a lot of these riders that, there's enough battery swapping stations to enable you to get onto the platform.
So the import restrictions or the challenges continue for India as well, because there is a fair bit of import that we are dependent on the EV ecosystem with respect to China. So there are going to be those considerations also that have a play. And also, more out of just making a point, the Africa number is actually a combination of the continent. Like yesterday, somebody made a point. It is not a single market. There are heterogeneous.
This is probably because we took a whole number for the
Exactly.
continent.
Otherwise, it would be higher for some of the markets.
Yeah, for East Africa, which is leading on the EV adoption. So in Rwanda, for instance, in December of 2023, 50% of the two-wheelers, new two-wheelers were electric.
That's right.
So East Africa, I think, is leading in the sense that, a lot of the things there that you see there's no fuel subsidies, so the cost of fuel is a lot higher. So you're seeing a lot more adoption on the eastern side of the continent as opposed to the rest of the continent. And so these are some of the tailwinds that we're seeing in terms of electric, especially two-wheeler adoption on the continent, which is, financing for the consumer, that's increasing. Urbanization is also helping. And then government support for EV adoption, especially in East Africa, is a lot more. And so that has, enabled the transition to happen. And then the cost incentives. So this is the, total cost of ownership for electric two-wheelers, especially in East Africa where the fuel prices are higher. And the government has introduced like all these tax incentives, has made the transition a lot faster on that side of the continent. And then, there's lots of players who are building the infrastructure needed to increase the adoption.
So we have gone through a fair bit of cold start, false start challenges. I'll quickly just run through, spending not more than a few seconds on each of those. There was this initial challenge around the quality of the vehicles, the ability to make sure that the vehicles are going to be suitable across various terrains and parts of the country. It was a chicken and egg. We were not seeing enough component manufacturers. There was a massive dependency on imports like we referred to a minute ago. The charging infrastructure, so there was always this mental anxiety around the fact that, okay, what if I get stuck? So that both for commercial and personal interests, it would end up limiting vehicles on the road. And finally, it does come down to financing as well. When you look at the India market in general, it's one of the lowest rate financing when it comes to cars. But that's not the same with EV in general. So we have this bit of circular reference in some sense drawing up. The next few slides, we just talk about expanding each of these challenges. I'll just let people have a quick glance through it. When it comes to component manufacturing, there have been a fair bit of thrust from the government. There has been also, it also fuels the whole manufacturing agenda, etc. So there has been an alignment of incentives both from the government as well as on the private side of things. But it is still intensive and it is still far from what it can be in terms of the headroom for growth is massive. Charging infrastructure, we have seen one of our own portfolio companies' success. And through the lens of Battery Smart, we have seen a fair bit of scale up happening across the tier 2 and 3. And we can almost correlate that income levels of people in the ecosystem end up going significantly, and there's a direct correlation with the extent of the charging infrastructure and the efficiency of the same. And finally, this is the missing piece, and I do feel that the combination of software plus hardware will make it a little more easy for financiers to come to the table, but it is still, I would say, very, very early days.
Yeah, and then similar to what you're seeing in India, in Africa, I think I talked about the high cost of ownership because of the imports that we do. But I think the biggest challenge I would say is on the limited capital. So a lot of the OEM players particularly are facing, longer fundraising periods. And that means there's not enough stock of electric two-wheelers on the continent. And then initially, there weren't that many fit-for-purpose vehicles on the continent. So a lot of we were relying on importing, mopeds and scooters from India and China, and that didn't work out well. And so those two, and then the other one was on the charging and, infrastructure around, battery swapping. That's kind of being sorted out, especially in the big cities on the continent. And then finally, it's on the standardization aspect of it. So I think standardization has not happened on the continent. So everyone is building on their own platform, different chargers, different
The interoperability.
it's very difficult.
It is creating a hassle. So in terms of the policy push, we have had a combination of demand side and supply side set of thrust. Some non-sustainable factors like tax incentives, subsidies, etc. We have seen government flip-flops around it as well. But the infrastructure expansion at an overall level, the things like the government participating in the policy around it, states coming to the whole front face and trying to create the EV as a service opportunity, all those do end up helping. A lot of those demand side incentives are not, I would say, semi-permanent in nature. They can't continue beyond a point. The supply side ones will end up being the key driver of the force, and I do feel that from a Blume standpoint, we talk about the fact that the combination of the battery supply chain development, the useful life growing significantly, we have seen that over the last 3, 4, 5 years growing to almost 2x of what it was, and the productivity, overall incentives, etc. to the PLI. So these combinations do make a potent approach for solving the infra on the ground.
Yeah, and in Africa, every country is implementing their own incentives. And as you can see, the East African countries, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania are the ones who've been more progressive on this. So in Kenya, for instance, they've introduced a specific or dedicated e-mobility tariff, which is like at 50% of the cost of electricity, which helps, with making that cheaper. And then they've also removed VAT and excise duty. Rwanda, which is the most progressive, they've removed all import duties, all taxes on EVs, batteries, and charging stations, which has made it really the leader in the space. And then the end of last year, they banned any importation of ICE motorbikes, which is very progressive. Ethiopia as well, so they banned any ICE vehicle importation. And so we've seen quite a lot of adoption in Ethiopia and Rwanda because of those government policies.
So like I mentioned in the opening remarks, we do observe that over the last 3 years, the overall funding has been falling. But the good news also is that the funding beyond the OEMs is something which is as a proportionate rising. As you massage the data, you realize the fact that that's constant and the proportion is rising. But that also is probably, hopefully, an indicator about the fact that now the industry has reached a point where, at least on the OEM side, you have a many number of players, both incumbents as well as startups, and there is a long tail of participants who end up trying to do two-wheelers and three-wheelers. So on an overall basis, there is still a massive opportunity and work to be done. It is far from a point where we can just take a step back and say things are on autopilot and will grow over the next 25 years. The funding push will continue to be required, and we will see a bunch of supply-side initiatives having to take over the demand-side pushes.
Yeah, and so on the continent, what we've seen, so we did this sector map on the e-two-wheeler space, and you can see there's like 3 business models that venture funding has supported, which is the OEM side and battery swapping. So on the continent, OEMs are also setting up battery swapping stations or infrastructure, and then the asset financing, and then the last one is fleet management and delivery platforms. And these are some of the notable companies or transactions we've seen on the continent and some of the investors who participated in some of these rounds. So the largest player is Spiro, which they've raised over $200 million. But compared to India, we're still very early. And then the last one is on the fleet managers who I think are the ones who are driving a lot of the early adoption on the continent. So I think we'll have a discussion with Greenwheels, which is one of the companies that is working with Uber to transition some of the two-wheeler fleets into electric on the continent. So, yeah, thank you.
So just a quick summary about similarities and contrast. So when we look at similarities, the rollout of the overall battery swapping infrastructure, that becomes a healthy similarity. On the overall challenges, both the regions did face cold start challenges. Charging infrastructure, financing, like I mentioned earlier, we've had policy initiatives, etc., have played a massive role to take it forward. And finally, we do see that the overall e-commerce sectors, quick commerce, etc., is giving a fair bit of thrust to both the regions. In terms of contrasts?
Yeah, so in terms of contrast from what you were saying, so I think the government intervention in India has been a lot better than on the continent. So on the continent, it's a lot more fragmented. Different countries are implementing different policies. And then in India, I think the government also did support on the demand side as well as on the supply side. I think on the continent, a lot of it is more from the supply side as opposed to the demand side. So there's no subsidy, for example, for you to buy an electric on the continent. And then what we're seeing also in terms of electrification across the different segments. So in India, what you're seeing is, there's increasing adoption of electric across the different types of vehicles. On the continent, it's mostly been two-wheelers and probably buses a little bit. And then the last one is, so I think what we saw, okay, I'm a little controversial here, but
No, please.
I was expecting, so we were in India the last 5 days, and one of the things I noticed was I'd always thought they were way, way ahead of us on the continent, but not so much in a lot of ways. And I feel, especially for the motorcycle side, if you look some of the bikes we have in Africa, from Ampersand, Rome, I think they'll do very well in the Indian market, and there's no equivalent in the Indian market. And also, some of the other differences we saw was on the caliber or the type of rider. So I think because of quick commerce, I think essentially there's a lot of short-termism.
That's right.
So they don't want, a lot of these riders are just there for maybe 12, 18 months. So they don't really want to own the bike. And so the bikes that are being provided on the market are very, within 12 months, I don't think, or 18 months, they're thrown out. But on the continent, I think a lot of the riders want to actually own their bike long term. And bike riding is pretty much a long-term career for a lot of them. You'll find someone who's been riding bikes for the last 10 years or 15 years, as opposed to India, where I think we saw
the commercial use cases on e-commerce and quick commerce is much more new.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you so
Thanks
much.
a lot. Thank you, BII.